A single gunshot started the First World War, but a single man's ambition lit the fire for the Second. This is how the world plunged into chaos once again. September 1st, 1939. The peaceful morning sky over Poland was shattered by the roar of German warplanes. Within minutes, explosions echoed across fields, cities, and villages. The world once again stood on the edge of destruction. The Great War, once called the war to end all wars, had merely been a rehearsal. From the ashes of defeat, Adolf Hitler rose to power. Germany had been broken by the Treaty of Versailles, stripped of its army, humiliated by debt, and haunted by hunger. But Hitler promised salvation. He rebuilt the military, reignited national pride, and promised to restore Germany's lost glory. His words were poison wrapped in passion, and a desperate nation followed. By 1938, Germany's ambitions were clear. First, Austria was annexed. The Anschluss. No bullets, no battles. The world watched and said nothing. Then came Czechoslovakia. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, met Hitler at Munich and returned home proclaiming, "Peace for our time." But peace was never in Hitler's plan. Appeasement had only fed the fire. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, German tanks crossed into Poland. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast, merciless, and devastating. The attack combined tanks, aircraft, and infantry in perfect coordination. Cities crumbled in days. Civilians fled in panic. Within weeks, Poland was gone, divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The world had changed overnight. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. The Second World War had begun. In the months that followed, Europe trembled. In April 1940, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway to control vital sea routes. Then came the storm on the west. On May 10, 1940, Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg once more, this time on Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The French Maginot Line, thought to be impenetrable, was outflanked. Within 6 weeks, Paris fell. It was a humiliation that stunned the world. France surrendered, and Nazi flags rose over its cities. Now only Britain stood alone. Across the English Channel, a new leader had taken charge. Winston Churchill. He was defiant, fearless, and unyielding. In his first speech as Prime Minister, he told his people, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." The British people prepared for invasion. Hitler planned Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But first, he had to destroy the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. German bombers filled the sky. London burned for months as bombs fell every night in what became known as the Blitz. Thousands died. Homes were destroyed, and the capital became a city of shadows. Yet the British refused to surrender. Fighter pilots, known as the Few, defended their skies with unmatched courage. Their success forced Hitler to abandon his invasion plans. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. As Britain held firm, the war expanded. Across Europe, Nazi forces tightened their grip. In 1941, Hitler turned his eyes eastward. He had always dreamed of conquering the vast lands of the Soviet Union. Though he had signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, it was nothing more than a temporary deception. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers poured across an 1,800-mile front. The Soviet army was caught off guard. Entire divisions were destroyed. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell in rapid succession. The Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable once again. But the further the Germans advanced, the more brutal the resistance became. Villages burned. Millions of civilians were massacred. By autumn, German troops reached the outskirts of Moscow. Yet the capital would not fall. As winter arrived, the temperature plunged below -30 degrees. Machines froze, food ran out, and the German advance stalled. Hitler's army had underestimated both the Russian winter and the resilience of the Soviet people. For the first time, cracks appeared in the Nazi Empire. While Europe burned, another storm was brewing across the Pacific. Japan, already allied with Germany and Italy, sought to dominate Asia. It had seized parts of China and eyed Western colonies in Southeast Asia. But standing in its way was the United States. Negotiations failed. On December 7th, 1941, Japan struck with devastating precision. Waves of aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within 2 hours, America's Pacific Fleet was in ruins. Battleships burned, smoke filled the sky, and over 2,400 Americans lost their lives. It was a day that changed history. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice was steady, filled with sorrow and resolve. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. Within hours, America declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The global conflict was complete. By the end of 1941, the world was engulfed in flames. Europe was under Nazi control. North Africa was a battlefield, and Asia bowed beneath Japan's rising sun. Millions were dead, and countless more would follow. Yet, in the darkest hours of human history, courage began to rise. Soldiers, resistance fighters, and ordinary civilians refused to surrender their humanity. The world was bleeding, but it was not defeated. In the next chapter of this story, we'll see how the tides began to turn, how sacrifice, unity, and sheer determination changed the course of history. This is the story of courage against tyranny, hope against despair, and light against darkness. The year is 1942. The world is drowning in war. Across Europe, Nazi flags fly from Paris to Warsaw. In Asia, the Japanese Empire stretches from China to the Philippines. Millions have already died, and the end is nowhere in sight. But in the smoke and ruin, small sparks of resistance begin to burn. Sparks that will soon ignite a global counterattack. The war in Europe had reached a crucial turning point. After months of brutal fighting, Hitler faced his first major challenge. The Soviet Union refused to fall. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the East, had begun as a swift and brutal advance, but by the end of 1941, it had stalled in the freezing cold. German soldiers, once confident of victory, now struggled to survive. Their weapons froze, their supplies ran out, and their morale began to collapse. By early 1942, the Germans regrouped. Hitler ordered his armies to strike south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Fuel was the lifeblood of war, and Germany needed it to keep its tanks moving. Along the way lay a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. It was just another name on the map to the German High Command. But to Hitler and Stalin, it became a symbol of pride, defiance, and destiny. The Battle of Stalingrad began in the summer of 1942. German bombers reduced the city to rubble, yet among the ruins, Soviet soldiers refused to yield a single street. Fighting was hand-to-hand, room to room, with entire buildings changing hands several times in a single day. Snipers stalked the shadows, grenades echoed through shattered factories, and the Volga River ran red with blood. As the winter of 1942 arrived, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. They encircled the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. Trapped and starving, the German soldiers begged for rescue. But Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man. When Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, over 90,000 Germans were taken prisoner. Only a few thousand would ever return home. Stalingrad became the graveyard of the Nazi dream, the turning point of the war in the East. While the Soviet Union bled in Stalingrad, another front of the war was raging in North Africa. For 2 years, the deserts of Libya and Egypt had echoed with the engines of tanks. At the center of it all stood two of the war's most brilliant commanders, Germany's Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and Britain's Bernard Montgomery. Rommel's tactics were fast and unpredictable, earning him both respect and fear from his enemies. But by late 1942, British forces had gained strength. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, Montgomery's army broke through German lines. Churchill later declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It marked the beginning of the end for German forces in Africa. Soon after, American troops entered the North African campaign through Operation Torch. Together with the British, they pushed the Axis forces westward. By May 1943, the last German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. The Allies now controlled North Africa, a stepping stone to the invasion of Europe itself. While these massive battles raged across continents, another war was being fought. A war of information, secrecy, and sabotage. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements were growing. Ordinary men and women risked their lives to fight back against tyranny. They destroyed railways, smuggled information, and rescued prisoners of war. In France, underground networks like the Maquis carried out daring missions that would later play a vital role in the liberation of their homeland. In Poland, resistance fighters recorded Nazi atrocities and smuggled reports to the Allies, exposing the horrors of the Holocaust to the world. The war was also changing on the seas and in the skies. In the Atlantic Ocean, German U-boats hunted Allied supply ships, trying to cut off food and weapons to Britain. Convoys of merchant ships, escorted by destroyers, faced constant danger. Many were sunk in icy waters. But technological advances, like radar and sonar, gradually turned the tide. By 1943, the Allies had gained the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic. In the air, the Allies began striking back. British and American bombers launched massive raids on German cities and industrial centers. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Night after night, the sky burned as thousands of tons of explosives rained down. Civilians paid a terrible price, but the strategy was clear: cripple Germany's war machine and break its spirit. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the United States was recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor. Early in 1942, Japan's expansion seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Philippines had fallen. But in June 1942, the tide shifted dramatically at the Battle of Midway. American codebreakers had discovered Japan's plan to attack the island, and the U.S. Navy prepared an ambush. In a fierce, four-day battle, American pilots sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a devastating blow from which Japan would never fully recover. By the end of 1943, the balance of power was changing. The Axis forces were being pushed back on every front. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army advanced westward after victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. In Italy, the Allies invaded Sicily and forced Mussolini from power. The fascist regime collapsed, and Italy switched sides, joining the fight against Germany. But the war was far from over. Hitler refused to surrender. The Nazi regime grew even more brutal as its defeat drew near. Concentration camps expanded, and millions more were murdered in the Holocaust. It was no longer just a war for territory. It had become a war for humanity itself. In 1943, the Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met in Tehran. There, they made a decision that would define the next phase of the war, to open a new front in Western Europe. The plan was bold and dangerous, an invasion of Nazi-occupied France. It would require immense coordination, secrecy, and courage. But if successful, it could finally bring an end to the darkness. By the end of 1943, hope was returning. The world had endured unimaginable suffering, but the dream of freedom had not died. Soldiers and civilians alike began to believe that victory was possible. The tide had turned, but the hardest battles still lay ahead. The war that had begun with lightning strikes and conquests would now end in fire and ruin. Cities would burn, empires would crumble, and the world would be forever changed. In the next chapter, we'll witness the final push. The D-Day invasion, the liberation of Europe, and the fall of the Third Reich. This is the story of sacrifice, redemption, and the price of freedom. The year is 1944. The world has been at war for nearly 5 years. Entire cities lie in ruins. Millions are dead. And yet the end still feels distant. But deep within the chaos, the Allies are preparing for something that will change the course of history: the liberation of Europe. For months, secret plans had been unfolding. Under the command of U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allied forces gathered in Britain, training, building, and waiting for the right moment. Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, would be the largest amphibious assault in history. Every detail mattered: timing, weather, deception. One mistake could doom it all. Across the English Channel, Hitler knew an invasion was coming, but not when or where. The Germans fortified the western coast, creating what they called the Atlantic Wall, a line of bunkers, mines, and defenses stretching from Norway to Spain. Hitler believed the Allies would land at Calais, the narrowest point between France and England. That miscalculation would prove fatal. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, darkness covered the skies over Normandy. Paratroopers dropped silently behind enemy lines, cutting communication lines and capturing key bridges. At dawn, the horizon filled with ships, over 5,000 of them. The sea was alive with steel and courage. On board were 156,000 Allied soldiers, Americans, British, Canadians, and men from across the free world. As the first landing craft hit the beaches, machine guns opened fire. The air filled with smoke, sand, and screams. At Omaha Beach, U.S. troops faced hell. Waves of men fell before even reaching the shore. But inch by inch, they pushed forward. By nightfall, the Allies had secured their beachheads. D-Day had succeeded. The liberation of Europe had begun. Within weeks, more than 1 million Allied troops poured into France. The German army, stretched thin and losing ground, fought desperately to hold its positions. By August, the Allies broke through German lines in Normandy and raced toward Paris. The French resistance, who had been waiting for this moment for years, rose up against the occupiers. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags and embracing their rescuers. The bells of Notre Dame rang once more, a sound that had been silenced for 4 long years. But even as victory seemed near, the war was far from over. Hitler refused to surrender. He ordered a last desperate counterattack in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, an operation meant to split the Allied lines and recapture the port of Antwerp. It began in December 1944, under the cover of snow and fog. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. For weeks, the bitter cold froze the ground and the blood of those who fought. American troops, outnumbered and surrounded in the town of Bastogne, refused to yield. When the Germans demanded surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. Reinforcements eventually broke through, and the German offensive collapsed. It was Hitler's final gamble, and it failed. From that moment, the end of Nazi Germany was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union launched its own massive offensive. After years of unimaginable loss, the Red Army was now stronger than ever. City after city fell to their advance. The Germans were driven back across Poland, through Hungary, and toward the heart of the Reich. The price was enormous, millions of lives lost, but the Soviet machine would not stop until Berlin was taken. As the Allies advanced from both east and west, they began uncovering the true horror of the Nazi regime. Hidden behind barbed wire and guarded by silence, they found the concentration camps, places of unimaginable suffering. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, Dachau. The scenes defied belief. Emaciated survivors, piles of lifeless bodies, gas chambers, and crematoria. The industrial scale of murder was beyond comprehension. The Holocaust, the darkest crime in human history, was finally revealed to the world. In the Pacific, the war was also reaching its climax. After victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, the United States began an island-hopping campaign, pushing closer to Japan. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed the world the terrible cost of invasion. Japanese soldiers fought to the death, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. Kamikaze pilots, willing to sacrifice their lives, crashed planes into American ships. The closer the Allies came to Japan, the bloodier the fighting became. Back in Europe, by April 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine River and were closing in on Berlin. Soviet forces encircled the city from the east, while the Americans and British advanced from the west. Germany was collapsing. Inside his bunker, beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler ranted and raved, giving orders to armies that no longer existed. His empire, once meant to last 1,000 years, was crumbling in a matter of days. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops stormed the city, Hitler took his own life. His body was burned in the garden above the bunker. 2 days later, Berlin fell. The war in Europe was finally over. On May 8, 1945, the Allies declared victory in Europe. VE Day. Crowds filled the streets of London, New York, and Moscow. People danced, sang, and wept. After 6 years of total war, the nightmare had ended. But even in celebration, the world could not forget what it had lost. Entire cities destroyed, tens of millions dead, and a generation scarred forever. Yet in the Pacific, the war continued. Japan refused to surrender. The United States prepared for a massive invasion that could cost millions of lives. But a new and terrible weapon would change everything: the atomic bomb. In the New Mexico desert, scientists had unlocked the power of the atom. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber named Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In seconds, the city was consumed by fire. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The destruction was beyond imagination. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was finally over. It had lasted 6 years, engulfed more than 60 countries, and claimed over 70 million lives. It was the deadliest conflict in human history, a war that reshaped the world forever. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of that war would never fade. Nations were rebuilt, alliances formed, and new rivalries born. From the ashes of war rose a divided world, one that would soon enter the Cold War era. The men and women who fought, suffered, and sacrificed in those dark years left behind a legacy that still defines us today. Their courage and endurance ensured that freedom would survive, even in humanity's darkest hour.
The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, but the echoes of war did not fade. Cities were gone. Families were scattered. An entire generation was marked by loss. From the ruins of Berlin to the ashes of Warsaw and the broken fields of Stalingrad, the world faced a single question: how could one man's vision lead to such destruction? In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Allied forces uncovered the true extent of Hitler's crimes. What they found was beyond imagination. Concentration camps, liberated one by one, revealed the horror that words could not describe. Mountains of shoes, piles of eyeglasses, and endless rows of emaciated survivors testified to the cruelty of a regime built on hatred. Millions of Jews, along with political prisoners, Romani people, and countless others, had been systematically murdered. The world stared into the darkness and realized this was not just war. This was genocide. In Nuremberg, Germany, the Allies established a tribunal to bring the architects of this evil to justice. Nuremberg trials became a symbol of moral reckoning. For the first time in history, leaders were held accountable not just for war, but for crimes against humanity. Inside the courtroom, the surviving figures of Hitler's regime sat behind glass. Men who had once commanded armies and dictated policy. Now, they faced evidence so overwhelming that silence filled the room. Film reels of death camps played before them. Witnesses spoke of torture, starvation, and extermination. The excuses of obedience and ignorance shattered under the weight of truth. When the verdicts were read, justice was served. Many were sentenced to death, others to long imprisonment. But the real punishment was the judgment of history itself, a record that would forever remember their crimes. As the trials continued, the world turned toward rebuilding. Germany lay in ruins, divided among the victors. The East fell under Soviet control. The West came under the protection of the United States, Britain, and France. The city of Berlin, once the heart of Hitler's empire, became a divided symbol of the New World Order. In the years that followed, a new conflict emerged, not fought with tanks and guns, but with ideology. The Cold War began, a silent struggle between capitalism and communism. Yet even amid this new tension, the memory of World War II lingered like a shadow. For the survivors, there was no easy healing. The trauma ran too deep. Entire families were gone. Cultures destroyed. Children who had grown up under Nazi propaganda now faced a world that demanded truth and reconciliation. For them, understanding what had happened became a lifelong burden. In the decades that followed, historians, filmmakers, and educators sought to ensure the past would never be forgotten. Documentaries, museums, and memorials rose from the ruins, each a reminder of what happens when hatred is left unchecked. Hitler's name became a warning, a symbol of absolute power's corruption, of blind obedience, and of how fragile freedom can be. His rise had shown how words could destroy nations. His fall proved that no tyranny lasts forever. The world that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was not perfect, but it was determined to change. The United Nations was created, aiming to prevent another global war. New laws were written to protect human rights. Science and technology advanced faster than ever before, driven by a desire to rebuild what had been lost. Yet even as progress came, the lessons of that era remained vital. Every generation that followed faced the same question: would humanity remember or repeat? Decades later, historians still study Hitler's life, not to glorify him, but to understand how a single man could manipulate a nation. He used fear as a weapon, pride as bait, and lies as truth. He turned anger into loyalty and unity into destruction. The tragedy of his reign was not just his evil, but how easily ordinary people followed him. That is the most painful truth of all, that evil is not born overnight. It grows slowly, nurtured by silence, by fear, and by the willingness to look away. Today, the ruins of the Third Reich stand as ghostly reminders. The bunkers, the camps, the memorials. They whisper stories to anyone willing to listen. Stories of victims and survivors, of courage and cruelty, of what happens when humanity forgets its conscience. For those who lived through it, World War II was more than history. It was a wound. For those who came after, it became a lesson written in blood. And at the center of it all stands one man whose dream of domination ended in a bunker beneath a ruined city. His empire collapsed, his armies destroyed, his ideology condemned. What remains is not his glory, but his failure. The failure of hatred to triumph over humanity. The war he began reshaped the planet. Borders were redrawn. Nations were reborn. The world entered a new age, one forged in sacrifice and vigilance. 80 years later, we still live in the shadow of that conflict. Every peace treaty, every human rights law, every warning about tyranny carries the echo of those years. The lessons of World War II remind us that freedom is fragile, truth is powerful, and silence can be deadly. Because in the end, history's greatest warning is not about Adolf Hitler himself, it is about the world that allowed him to rise.